Thank you very much indeed. And welcome to everyone joining us from wherever you are. It's afternoon here in the UK, it's afternoon in Brussels, but I'm aware it's morning the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome to this latest in the Atlantic Treaty Association's series of ATA talks. Those familiar to this series will know that this has been recently re-established, and we invite leading experts to share their experience and expertise on the current and emerging security issues that we face, especially, of course, those relating to NATO. This is the second in the series, which is focusing, of course, on NATO 2030 and the forthcoming NATO summit. And we are absolutely delighted to have as our guest someone who, speaking of summits, has been at the very peak of NATO itself and served as the 10th Secretary General, and therefore is in a position to offer an absolutely unique perspective on current events and the likely outcomes and prospects for the next NATO summit. I will be introducing Lord Robertson properly later, but at the same time, let me welcome Ambassador Baiba Braže, who has kindly agreed to host, to moderate again this session. I can't do her career justice because I need to be brief. So if I can just touch a few highlights. When Latvia regained its independence, Ambassador Braže was actually one of the people helping to lay down the legal foundations when she was still a law student. After graduating, she entered the Foreign Service and has had what can only be described as a stellar career. Just some of the highlights: she was the head of the European office in the Foreign Ministry as Latvia was preparing for both NATO and EU entry. So I should imagine that was a period when she didn't get that much sleep, but it all paid off. She's held several absolutely key diplomatic posts. Of course, she was the ambassador to the Netherlands and also the Latvian representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. 2016, she became ambassador to the United Kingdom, where she was actually until the beginning of last year, during what can only be described as a particularly interesting period in the UK international relations, and she was actually a very familiar figure on the UK media as a commentator on the events that were taking place at the time. Not only has she done all those things, she took time to get a degree in communication science and was the Director General of the Communications Department in the Latvian Foreign Ministry as well. I think that she brings, therefore, a completely unique and totally appropriate skill set to the position she now occupies, running NATO's public diplomacy division. So thank you, Ambassador Braže, for agreeing to participate today. Lord Robertson is described, if you see the references as you often do in the press, you see is described as a grandee of the British Labour Party. And he's still very much a public figure in the United Kingdom. Again, I must just simply skate over the highlights. So let me go straight to his period as Minister of Defence back in the late 1990s, when he was crucially involved in decisions regarding NATO's involvement in what was going on then in the Balkans, which was both very sensitive and extremely important. And he is recognised as the architect of a strategic defence review, which is seen by those who specialise in these things as one of the most acclaimed and successful post-war defence reviews that the United Kingdom has conducted. That placed him in extremely good stead to become NATO's Secretary General. It's difficult, again, I must just do a few key highlights. Of course, who can forget that it was Lord Robertson at the helm when NATO invoked, for the first and we hope only time in its history, Article 5. And I'm sure many of us have heard him speak eloquently and movingly about that period in history. a remarkable, remarkable period, and I have to say, a remarkable man at the helm steering us through it. On his watch, NATO assumed command of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, something which has clear resonance still today. And of course, he was helping the alliance prepare for the largest round of enlargement in its history, which you can't overstate the importance of that. Which leads me to some extent to say he also has a reputation for being extremely frank and candid, and also has the ability to deliver a tough message kindly and gently, and particularly skilled at telling a joke against himself. And I'll give one example. When I heard he was in a candidate country, now a member country, and he was asked after the series of meetings there if he was always so rude. And he said, "I prefer to be rude now than to be disappointing later." And whatever blend of rudeness and diplomacy he brought, it was extremely successful. And as a consequence of that, many of us are now here today. So by way of introduction, let me now hand over to Ambassador Braže. 2 points of housekeeping. You can still submit questions through the Q&A facility. Please be brief, because Monika's doing all the hard work collating those. And also, Ambassador Braže will have to depart about halfway through, so she will hand over the moderation to Monika and myself, and we'll bounce back and forth, alternating with the questions that are still coming in. So thank you very much indeed. Ambassador Braže, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hobbs, and thank you to the Atlantic Treaty Association in the UK for the great work you are doing, including model NATO events and many others. It's my special pleasure, of course, to see Lord Robertson today. Last time we met barely a year ago. The pandemic was not yet there, and hopefully next time we meet, we can meet in person. And Lord Robertson is still remembered fondly at the NATO HQ, both in the civilian but also in the command, both on the civilian and military side, for his quick wit and his approachability, but also while being strategic, still being able to relate to each and everyone in his team and the wider NATO team, from giving treats to his entourage and paying particular attention to staff at NATO, to actually being able to relieve a pretty complicated situation at the NAC table with a good sense of humor. So indeed, as you said, from Article 5, that was for the first time announced by NATO, and that emotional speech that we all remember that Lord Robertson made, to the laying foundation for the enlargement and the mission in Afghanistan, the biggest mission that NATO has had. He presided over NATO through the very complicated years of adaptation, but a successful adaptation. Currently, we are going through another adaptation, and Secretary General's initiative on 2030 is very much the expression of that adaptation. So what it entails is indeed NATO as a military political alliance. First pillar, it has to remain strong militarily. So we are looking how to adjust our defense deterrence. We have entered an age of systemic competition. So there will be an update of the strategic concept at the next summit, and very likely the leaders will mandate it at this summit. The investment in defense has been growing, but it's not only about hard defense capabilities. We have to look at the dual capabilities, at the emerging defense and disruptive technologies, and how NATO adapts to these new realities when it's not just anymore about the hard capabilities, but also about the overall societal readiness and ability to defend. That's why resilience will be the second big pillar where the summit will take some decisions and will guide us for the years to come. Of course, stronger and more united politically is where the alliance's power lies. So not only allies feel that they have to be able to consult and decide faster and, you know, along more united core. So but also that they have to reaffirm the values that we stand for in this world, where again we are challenged by our potential adversaries from various countries, from various places, through all domains. And again, NATO already has announced cyber as a new domain a few years ago, but we have been looking also at space as a new domain and discussing, you know, how NATO adjusts to this reality where space, indeed, as operational domain, also needs to be advanced. What we need, of course, is much more global approach in terms of understanding and supporting these global values on which our democratic societies are based. So through the more political consultation, through the regular dialogue with our global partners, not only we will raise the strength and understanding within the alliance, but also it will help us to address the challenges that are there for us, be it from China or be it emerging disruptive technologies or space or anything else that is there. So it's in a global world, we need global partners because we have global challenges and global threats. Then when indeed we look at that all, we also understand that to prepare for the future, to prepare for the 2030, we as the alliance has to very strongly, once again, invest in our defense capabilities, invest in our civilian capabilities, invest in partnerships and training, in creating that community that protects each other. So this is what the main agenda at the summit will be. It will reaffirm a very strong transatlantic bond that has been there. Again, when we look back at the first authorization of Article 5 under Lord Robertson to the President Biden's first visit to NATO on June 14th this year, we have gone a long way, but there is even longer way still ahead of us, and the most successful defense alliance, our transatlantic alliance, is as livid and vivid as ever.
Okay, well, I've spoken to Lord Robertson beforehand, and he's very happy to go straight to Q&A, Baiba, so right. I'm happy to go straight back to you, and thank you very much indeed for that terrific introduction to the issues that will no doubt be coming up as Lord Robertson gets his questions. Thank you.
I think the first question actually is that we got from the UK, and which very much goes in line with what Lord Robertson presided over is about the Article 5. And the question is as follows, that you were Secretary General when NATO invoked Article 5, the collective defense article, for the first and only time in our history of NATO. So those circumstances indeed were very different, and both in terms of hostile actor, geography, and the nature. So anyway, it seems that Article 5 then was certainly fit for purpose. And how would you see today, when we have all these cyber attacks and hybrid threats, do we need to update Article 5? That is a question from UK.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's lovely to be with you again, even if only virtually. I remember our time in London together very well, and I wish you well in the new position there. So yeah, the question is a good one. Article 5 was written in 1949. It's a remarkable piece of drafting. When we consider invoking it in 2001, 20 years ago from now, many people knew about it in general terms, but didn't actually know what it said specifically. And in order for it to be agreed at the time, and I think this is quite important to remember, in order to get through the United States Senate, who were very, very, in many ways, very hostile to the idea that America would be dragged into another European war, Article 5 has two parts. One is the general principle: an attack on one country is an attack on all countries in the alliance. But the second bit of it then says what you do about it. So it's quite distinct. There is a principle, i.e. we're all on the same side. But secondly, what do you do about it is the subject of a completely different decision. So I think it's actually quite fit for purpose. Remarkably, even after all these years, 72 years, if you actually read it and see what it says and what the import is, but the main message is that an attack on one, however small, is an attack on every country. Now, the American senators who raised objections in 1949 could not have conceived that the first time it would have been invoked in 2001 would actually be in defense of the United States of America. And there's one of the ironies involved in it. But it represents a bright red line over which no country can go without fearing massive repercussions. And therefore, whether it's a cyber attack or a hybrid attack, then an adversary or a potential adversary knows that if they cross that line, then the consequences are very, very grave indeed. So we may have to look at the strategic concept. We might have to look very carefully, as the 2030 report does, at the new world in which we inhabit. But the principle of an attack on one country being seen as an attack on all countries remains the abiding principle and the ultimate determinant.
Yes, and indeed, how do we apply that both in the cyber and in the space? And there are discussions, and there are very interesting, of course, pieces of work that are produced by lawyers, you know, how to relate to the territory and the scale. But again, NATO has adapted to all those challenges, and there is no doubts that we will do also. And it's great to see also how united politically we are in that respect, be it against the challenges such as some of the neighboring countries have presented, NATO neighboring countries have presented to us, be it with aggressive actions in Ukraine or Georgia, or as you rightly said, terrorist attacks against one of the allies. We have another question that comes from Romania, and it is on NATO's expansion. So when you look at the partnership with Georgia and Ukraine that NATO has, and the events of the last years when Russia has waged its aggressive actions against both of the countries, what do you say about NATO's expansion and how that would affect relations with Russia?
Well, I remember at the time of the enlargement of NATO to include your country as well, there was a distinction between expansion and enlargement. It was a bit of a theoretical argument at the time, but it was based on a principle about whether or not NATO was going to be confined to the original countries, or that you could sort of say, sorry, we are not going to allow anybody else in. And therefore, each application for membership was decided on its own merits. And that depended on whether the country itself was ready for membership. In other words, were its value sets in accordance with the NATO value sets? Were there sustainable democratic institutions in the country? Was the military up to NATO standards? All of these things had to be taken account of. And you also have to take account of whether or not NATO would be able to deliver the Article 5 commitment. There's no point in saying that, sort of a country in southern Africa would qualify for members of NATO because you couldn't then deliver the Article 5 commitment of an attack on one country being an attack on all countries. So each country had to do it on its own basis. And that is why some of the countries didn't come in to membership in 1999, because it was seen that they were not ready. David tells the story about my experience with one prime minister when I said I'd rather be rude to you now than apologetic in 2002, and that is because these countries had to actually come up to NATO standards. It wasn't a question about just opening the door and saying you can come in willy-nilly. You have to be able to be a full member of the organization. You cannot, by coming into NATO, weaken the attractiveness of NATO to you as a country. So every decision is taken on its merit. So as and when Ukraine or let's say the Balkan countries, countries like Serbia and Bosnia get to the level where people in NATO believe that they have satisfied all of the different criteria, then a decision will be taken by the heads of state and government at that time. But the work on getting up to NATO standards is the constant one. And it's also, frankly, a constant job of work for the people who are actually in NATO at the
Indeed. And as you rightly point out, it's decision on the expansion. It's a decision for NATO and decision for that particular applicant country. So NATO's doors are open. We stand by the decisions that were taken in Bucharest and other summits. But again, it's for the NATO to take that decision when that will happen. And it's for those countries to get their reforms and to get their readiness in such a stage that there is very convincing case. And that's why NATO supports both Ukraine and Georgia through special programs and enhanced opportunity partnership, and stands very committed for its territorial integrity and not to recognize either illegal annexation of Crimea, but also clearly express its point of view on the illegal actions by Russia with regard to borders in South Ossetia or Abkhazia. Sorry for that. So in short, yes, we stand very committed with support to both of the applicant countries, but also to others. But the decision is for us and for that country. Now we have a question from Germany, and of course NATO in 2019 in its London declaration for the first time spoke about China, recognizing that it's both a challenge and opportunity for NATO. And we know that China has been greatly expanding its military capabilities on nuclear, on conventional, at sea, at air, and in space. So indeed, we are trying to understand what it means. When we look at the wider global challenges, China should be a partner, for example, for overcoming climate change, including climate security. That will be the new big theme also for NATO, to become that platform, global platform where climate security issues are addressed. Then, in of course, looking at China's behavior that is coercive towards its neighbors, but also not exactly a standard of respect for human rights or for values, democratic values, as we stand for. And in that respect, China indeed is something that we are discussing among the allies. And the question from Germany is that China is challenging the West not only militarily, but also by its political system, which it advocates as an alternative Western democracy. Do you, Secretary General, former Secretary General Robertson, foresee a shift of the focus of NATO towards East Asia in the future?
Well, the focus of attention will certainly move towards the Indo-Pacific region because of its strategic importance to the Euro-Atlantic area as well. But NATO's primary responsibility is to the defence of its own members, and that means inevitably that the Euro-Atlantic area will be the priority. But we can't stay isolated. The situation in North Africa affects the security of the countries of the Euro-Atlantic area. The situation in the Middle East has an effect. The terrorist acts that led to Article 5 in 2001 came from the mountains of the Chora Bora in Afghanistan. So we can't simply be insular of the fact that NATO was formed in order to protect the territory of Europe and the United States of America. And for if there are challenges coming from away, as indeed they are from China, both economically and militarily, then has got to be aware of it. I noticed, I heard the news this afternoon just before I came on this program, and apparently the Chinese Communist Party have now announced their diplomats are going to be a bit more diplomatic, which I think is quite an interesting concept, because of course their diplomats at the present moment are not diplomatic. They are hectoring, they are noisy, they are very, very hostile.
In terms of communications and public diplomacy, indeed, we noticed during the COVID pandemic, the first wave and also the second waves, that the communications by Chinese officials were pretty straightforward and pretty loud with regard to accusing allies of being the reason of creation of COVID and spreading it, and that correlated also to Russia's communications against NATO, that as if NATO was spreading COVID through its exercises and other activities. So in that respect, I agree, this is an interesting development. But again, discussing China or trying to understand China and its behavior is an obligation for us. When we look at the scale of challenges that NATO is dealing with in terms of security and defense, of course, it's not just the tanks or planes or ships at our borders. In the current global world with technology and the internet and the mega data that is being passed, and the new technologies such as AI developing and being used also in military sphere, it is indeed an obligation for us to deal with this. Having said that, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization, and as Lord Robertson said, of course, our obligation is to each other for security and defense. We have a question also from Italy. So during the pandemic, NATO proved it is capable of adapting to changes. And I can add that, of course, NATO very quickly showed that it was able to help allies, we were able to help allies, but also our military was able to help medics and civilians and build hospitals and provide assistance through the whole Euro-Atlantic sphere, but also beyond to partners in other countries that are not members to the alliance. So the question is, do you think that adapting to new security challenges for a big alliance and organization such as NATO, is it a difficult task? And do you think it affects NATO's possibilities in facing other current and possible threats? So from what I see, it's basically whether the adaptation to the new emerging security challenges will influence our ability to deter and defend. My answer would be no, but I would like to hear what Lord Robertson says.
Well, my answer is no as well. I think the secret of NATO's success is that it has been able to adapt to a new world, to changing circumstances, to different threats, to the whole sort of environment in which we operate. And I think that it will continue to do that. I tell people that when I had my last defense ministers meeting at Colorado Springs in America, I gave a bottle of Scotch malt whiskey, a bottle of whiskey that comes from this island where I'm speaking today. And in exchange, I got a T-shirt. Now, it seems to most people that's a pretty bad bargain, bottle of the finest malt whiskey in the world for a T-shirt. But why I prized the T-shirt was because the slogan on it was very simple and straightforward. And it said, "This ain't your daddy's NATO." And that seemed to sum up my view of NATO even then, and that was 20 years ago. So NATO adapts and moves and changes all the time. And now the pandemic has shown that we have new vulnerabilities, that the fragility of our countries is not simply one based on guns and planes and ships. It can be something much more subtle and indeed much nastier when you get a virus like the coronavirus affecting the Euro-Atlantic area and the world as a whole. And yet NATO had to adapt very quickly to it. What were NATO's strengths? Militarily, we have a huge organization that is based essentially on interoperability and on logistics. We can move people, we can move formations, we can move headquarters very, very quickly indeed because of the exercising we've done over the years. And suddenly that became a precious skill when it came to dealing with the pandemic, the medical necessities, and the rest of it. And therefore our armed forces ceased to be instruments of war, but became instruments of medical necessity as well. So I don't think that NATO is outmoded the slightest. It's capable of adapting all of the time. And it must continue to do so because as the world changes, NATO has to change as well. And it certainly is not your daddy's NATO.
I couldn't agree more. And it also showed that the actual training, the training on business continuity, on exercises, on crisis responses, and the so-called baselines of resilience really means something. That if we have those exercises that test our resilience, we actually have systems in place and response mechanisms and people and organizations in place who know how to respond and who have sufficient supplies, who have supply lines, and who are able to really deal with it. So in that respect, I think the military organizations indeed are in a better place in a number of cases in these situations because we exercise and because we prepare for those types of scenarios. And again, that is why the resilience, these baselines, which provides a necessity for allies to ensure that they have efficient transport services, that they have it's an ability to recover from shock and overcome crisis, that they have infrastructure in place, that they have people and teams in place, telecommunications infrastructure, but also the efficient government communications, that they have a medical system in place and that is able to help people in large scales of medical contingencies. So there is a whole set of these baselines that allies are implementing nationally. Then we have a question, what is your opinion on the NATO and European Union cooperation? It's a long tradition. it's a part, both organizations are part of post-Second World War institutional arrangements to ensure both security and prosperity in Europe and Euro-Atlantic region. But when we see that European initiatives with regards to defense are growing and ambition is growing, what is your opinion?
Well, I came into NATO at a time of evolving cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And indeed, one of my proudest achievements was establishing and finalizing what is known as the Berlin Plus arrangements, which provided for access to NATO capabilities by the European Union in a case where there was a circumstance that required Europe to act rather than the whole of the transatlantic alliance. Now, you know, most people have never heard of the Berlin Plus arrangements. I'm well aware of that. It might be a matter of my pride, but the Berlin Plus arrangements have sort of gone into abeyance because of some squabbling between individual members of the EU and the members of NATO as well. But they still exist as a mechanism whereby the European Union can access the capabilities of NATO to deal with something on their own, basically on their own territory, where the United States and Canada would not want to be involved. But, you know, as the European Union gains in confidence in terms of defence, if its countries are encouraged in the interests of the EU to acquire the capabilities that are required for the future, then they will simply add to the armoury that is available to NATO when NATO is acting as well. I've never seen it as being a rivalry or a competition. It would be if the European Union was to be creating unnecessary capabilities, if it was to try and duplicate what happens at SHAPE, then that would be a waste of money, a waste of effort, and a waste of precious time as well. But insofar as the European Union gains a capability of dealing with these subjects that are not the subject of NATO's particular business and can access NATO's invaluable planning processes, then that has to be to the benefit of everybody as a whole. I think that sometimes one ambassador once said, we are in danger of scalding ourselves in cold water. You know, it seems to me to be a self-evident fact that the more the European Union gains the capabilities, then the better both NATO and the EU will be able to tackle the kind of security threats that will come in the future. You know, the EU has got capabilities in terms of aid, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of economic development, but NATO does not have and is never going to have. And at the same time, NATO has got organizations like SHAPE, planning processes that the European Union would be mad to try and duplicate. So collectively, we're all, as they say, we're all in the same side against the challenges that face all of us in the future.
I fully agree with you, and of course we have also had EU dealing with the same security challenges, be it on technology and technological development side, the AI, the social media platforms that are creating a lot of challenges for the societies and in our communication sphere. So in that respect, of course, EU is a natural partner to solve it. Also on military mobility, for example, when we look at how we resupply our forces or how we move our forces, we clearly see that there is a complementarity to our efforts with the EU, also coping with challenges outside our borders. And having said that, we need to remember that while out of NATO's 1 billion citizens, 66% live in EU countries. Only 20% of defense spending come from the countries. So indeed, raising defense spending and raising capabilities is something that EU allies could do more. Then we have the question from Spain. So sometimes allies do have a different threat perception. So, Lord Robertson, in your view, do you think it can be a cause of a lack of a united intervention, or that political unity to make a decision?
Yeah, a lot of people think that an organization with 30 members is going to find it difficult to get a common position. In my time, it was 19 countries, and that was a lot as well. But yet, on the 12th of September 2001, those 19 countries, over a period of about 7 hours, having consulted every capital in the 19 countries, made the decision to invoke Article 5. So, I know that most people will say, well, there isn't the consensus in different countries and competing political objectives and different sort of leaders. As and when the situation arises, I have no doubt whatsoever that NATO will come together and the countries of NATO will come together. It may well be that, like in the case of Libya, where the decision collectively is taken that action must take place, but that it should be left to a number of the countries in NATO to take that action, then that allows NATO to be more flexible than perhaps it was seen in the past. Again, that was an adaptation of the general principle that used to apply. So I think that kind of thing may well happen again in the future. The general concept is of solidarity, but each case is then dealt with on its merits. I know when I spoke to a NATO defense minister recently who was complaining bitterly that North Atlantic Council meetings now, because there are 30 members around the table, is simply a repetition of individual speeches. There isn't any opportunity for debate, because by the time 30 ministers or ambassadors have made their national speech, then that's it. And this minister said to me, I don't see why we don't just send in our speeches in advance. And maybe that will come. Maybe that will come, because I think the benefit that I had with 19 countries was that there was an opportunity sometimes to debate things, to argue about things, to discuss things across the North Atlantic Council table and come to an informed conclusion at the end of the day. Occasionally, tempers were raised. Occasionally, national positions were articulated with considerable strength. I got known for having a degree of humor sometimes, because I can tell you it was necessary to sometimes break the tension, because the issues around the NATO table are very, very important. Sometimes they can be life and death. So debate is going to be increasingly necessary. But at the end of the day, there has never been a security challenge that has not reached a consensus decision around the table. That's the great benefit of NATO, that people are meeting every week. Ministers are meeting 3 to 4 times a year, and you can't leave the table without some sort of agreement being arrived at. And it's a huge strength for the organization. And I think it's going to be something that will apply increasingly in the future as the threats evolve and our publics need to be protected.
Yes, and it's been fascinating to me in my first year to see how actually agile the decision making at 30 can be, and how united allies can be, and even the most complicated situations that we have had among the allies can be talked through, and the solution can be reached. We saw it through the military consultation channel last year in the East Med. And we have seen it throughout the alliance's history. And when we think about the adaptation, we need to remember that when the discussions between the US and the Western Union started in 1948 on creating the new alliance that resulted in NATO, in North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, the external enemy was Germany. It was how it was perceived. So we have gone through a big change. So we have started the next step to ensure the alliance is as strong as ever. And I will leave you with my last question, but the discussion will continue. And I look forward to seeing you in person, Lord Robertson, whether in London or in Brussels. But and the last question that I have here is about the transatlantic link. And throughout the years, there have been different periods and different challenges, and there were more tumultuous and rocky stages in the relationship between European and American allies. And the transatlantic bond currently is, of course, in a very strong place with President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau. So the question is, how do we strengthen? What are the practical links that can be strengthened to strengthen this transatlantic link? And how do we ensure that the North America and that they know that the security of North America is tied to the security of Europe, and there is a public support for that?
So it's a good question, and I think it's one that we should constantly ask ourselves, because the fact is that it is a common security. We have shared defense, common defense, because we, the democracies, live in the same world with the same threats, both externally and internally as well. Now, if the Americans thought, as some of them did, at the foundation of NATO, that they could pull up the drawbridge, ignore Europe as being a sort of a remote sort of part of the world, and that they dealt with Europe twice in the last century, saved Europe in the First and Second World Wars, and therefore they had finished that job, then the 11th of September 2001 told them graphically that they were not going to be able to pull up the drawbridge, that the Atlantic Ocean was not a moat round fortress America that could never be reached. Some guys with some box cutters driving civilian aircraft went right into the heart of America's commercial district and right into America's hearts as well. So they knew at that point that there were common threats, and that they were privileged to be part of an organization like NATO, which is part of America's insurance policy. It's not just a liability, as some senators said in 1949, a liability that risked the United States being dragged into another European civil war, but that it actually was an insurance policy to protect America. You can build, alliances, coalitions of the willing. Some Americans over the years have said we can always have a coalition of the willing, but no coalition of the willing compares to having 29 other permanent allies with you all of the time, every week of the year. These 29 allies are with you, standing by you. And on the 11th of September 2001, absolutely with you in your defense as well. So the umbilical connection between continental Europe and Canada and the United States is one of self-interest. Now, we had a period under President Trump where that was questioned, but then he questioned so many other things as well. And ultimately, the democratic process removed him and put in place a president absolutely committed over the years to NATO, and now reaffirming it and likely to articulate that view very clearly in the next couple of weeks. You know, I knew President Biden when he was Senator Biden. I knew him when he was Vice President Biden, and he is somebody who lives the transatlantic relationship. He believes in it intimately, but he believes in it because it's in America's own self-interest. And as long as that self-interest on both sides of the Atlantic continues, then the transatlantic link will remain as strong as it has been.
And as we have seen throughout the history, from the First World War, from the Second World War, wherever a local conflict can start, it spreads and it becomes something that the allies, today's allies, all have had to come together to stand up for each other. So especially with the US involvement, was it in the First World War, was it in the Second World War? So we are there for each other. You're totally right. With this, I say goodbye for now, and I let our very able Secretary General of ATA, Monika, take over. And I would like to thank also the ATA's president, Jim Townsend, for his role in revitalizing the organization and being such a great partner for NATO. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador, for chairing this part of session. So Mr. Hobbs and I are going to continue now as we announced in the beginning. So David, if you would like to continue with this part of session.
Thank you very much indeed, Monika. This one segues rather nicely from the previous one, particularly because it refers to President Biden, because of course it was Vice President Biden when NATO agreed the Wales defence spending commitment, which has evolved, in my opinion, very sensibly from an aspiration to a commitment and to a pledge. But I've got several questions I'll try and put together here, because of course burden sharing has always been a source of tension in the transatlantic relationship. And as we look at the Wales defence spending pledge, it says here, of course, it's quite clear, and indeed several European countries have said explicitly, that they're not going to make the 2024 deadline. So what can be done to encourage those allies to do better and to meet the deadline? And a related question is, of course, some people, as they always have, argued that GDP percentage isn't the best measure. But of course, it's probably the best there is. Okay, that's my view. But are there other measures that could be better? Or is that just some people looking for a creative excuse? My gloss at the end.
Well, no, it all boils down to the same thing, and that is having the right capabilities to be able to deal with the challenges of the future. I don't think that 2% itself is the right measure, but then neither does Secretary General Stoltenberg. And that is why the Wales summit and subsequent and previous summits have made it clear that spend on equipment is one.
Yes.
There's no point in spending it on a lot of troops that can't be deployed. So there's that. The Secretary General Stoltenberg has also brought in the question of readiness, because if troops are not ready, then and therefore are unavailable, then what utility are there as well? So there's a series of measurements that have now been brought in. So there are some countries who have got more of their troops ready, available, but don't come up to the 2% spending level, but they can be often much more useful with that. There are countries who come up and sometimes exceed the 2%, but are spending it largely on troops that can't be deployed outside national boundaries, or conscripts that can't really be used for very much at all. So I think we've got to have a much more mature view about the kind of capabilities that NATO needs and how we try to encourage countries to develop along that line. But, you know, investment in defence is got to be seen as being a national insurance. And in many ways, you know, President Trump, you know, for all his failings, you know, by banging a drum about spending more, did at least bully some countries into spending, and the level of spending has gone up considerably over that time. But the other person who has had a significant effect on defence spending in NATO is President Putin. And President Xi is another one, you know, because I think people have woken up to the fact that you don't get national safety on the cheap. And now that we have seen this new vulnerability through germs, people, I think, have woken up to the fact that, you know, if you've got a virus, and I saw a man called Fareed Zakaria has written a very, very good book called 10 Lessons for the Post-Pandemic World, and I strongly recommend it to people. But he made the point that the virus is 1/10,000th of the size of the full stop at the end of the sentence in the book. 1/10,000th of the full stop there as well. So, and yet we've seen the damage that it could do, more than any weapon that has yet been developed in the world. And if that was a natural phenomenon, then so be it. If it was a leak from a laboratory, well, that's a bad, nasty accident. But that technology exists of creating pathogens. You know, so, you know, that's the kind of world that we now live in, and the vulnerability that we have. And if we're not capable of rising to that challenge, then we're letting down the people of our countries at the same time. So the combination of these factors should be driving countries to making decisions in their national budgets about the safety and security of their people. And I think that that is going to be the lesson of the summit meeting on the 14th of June. And it's a lesson which I hope people are going to listen to.
Thank you. Monika.
Thank you very much. You mentioned this virus and the current health pandemic. We can say that it has been accompanied by so-called infodemic that actually understands how big influence of information on everyday life is. However, there are these days many examples of disinformation that very often appears to satisfy some interest goals and mislead a group of people, thus changing their views, stance, etc. So do you think that NATO should engage more, and how, if you think it is, in providing instructions on how to recognize and how to deal with this information, how to check the facts, and in a way encourage and empower people to know what to do when it is evident that the information is inaccurate, fake, or misleading, and actually how to find out the correct information. Because we live in a digital world and we have to work on this building of societal resilience. So I would like to hear your opinion on this actually new thing that is going on globally.
Yeah, I hope you're hearing me. I think it keeps saying my connection is unstable, so then maybe there's some malicious effort being made to disrupt me. But you're absolutely right. What you say is very, very correct. We are surrounded now by the means of disinformation have previously never been known before. And whether it is through social media or simply through the press or word of mouth, it's becoming increasingly difficult to know what is true and what is not true. So does NATO have an obligation in this regard? Of course it does. It can't run its own radio stations and social media organizations. But what it can do is to constantly remind the people in the countries of NATO why NATO exists, why collective security matters, why the money that is spent, their taxpayers' money spent on defense, is being done to ensure their safety and their families' security. So NATO needs, in my view, to do more of that. In my time, and I must, confess not to doing enough about it, the individual countries said it was up to them to tell people what NATO was about. And in some countries, that was done very professionally and very successfully. In other countries, it was lamentable. And now we've got a growing generation who don't know what on earth NATO is. It's just a series of initials. It may have something to do with the Cold War. People might think it has to do with Afghanistan, but by and large, they don't know about collective security and Article 5. And therefore, I think NATO has to do more of that. And it may have to take it out of the hands of individual governments and do its own dissemination of information. I could give you an example. At the time when Crimea was annexed by the Russians, the NATO Information Office, which is brilliant, the NATO Information Office is producing really, truly brilliant pieces of genuine information and fact sheets. But they produced a series of fact sheets, taking the Russian arguments and contradicting them, each one of them. Just Q&A that simply put on the line what the Russian lies were and what the answers to them were. Now, how many governments disseminated these even to their own legislators? I don't think very many. Certainly in my country, I asked the question of ministers and they said no. They hadn't distributed any of these to members of parliament, never mind to the public as a whole. So I think that there is a genuine obligation. And here's where ATA, the Atlantic Treaty Association, has got a responsibility to push individual governments, where the ATA branches are, to do the dissemination of the quality products made by the NATO Information Office. And I think that would do help with the disinformation that is being pumped out by the Chinese, by the Iranians, by the North Koreans, and of course by the Russians as well.
Thank you. I'm sure, by the way, that will be music to the ears of my colleague Riaz Ravat, who is always telling me, because he's focusing very much on the need to address youth. And he says we face a constant wall of disinformation, and it starts early, and we've got to develop critical thinking at an early age for people and get the message out about NATO. You can't start too soon. Okay, several questions relating to the updated strategic concept. So I won't put you in a straitjacket. It's quite clear. I think we can all put money on the fact that the summit's going to decide that it's time to update the strategic concept. It's been well signalled. What do you think the key features will be? What will be different from the 2010 strategic concept?
Well, they kept telling me when I was in NATO that we needed to look at the strategic concept. And, I worried really about the waste of energy that is involved sometimes in arguing over words and phrases of a document that hardly anybody actually reads. And I resisted it, but eventually they did it. And in 2010, they produced a new strategic concept. So, and it includes a number of some of the newer threats and newer challenges, and that is quite right as well. But let's not get ourselves bogged down in a process that takes a lot of energy and a lot of time out of what should be immediate challenges that we have to face at the present moment. But if people want to get an idea of what should be in a new strategic concept, let them read the report of the Reflections Group, the 2030 Reflections Group that was set up by the Secretary General at the London meeting. It's almost buried in the NATO website, which I think is completely crazy. It's a brilliant document encompassing all of the problems and difficulties, challenges and opportunities that are there and facing NATO in 2030. And the other thing is, it's extremely well written. It's readable, unlike so many other documents produced by consensus, which you can see the cutting and pasting that went on. The 2030 Reflections Group report is very, very readable, comprehensive, and I think very convincing as well. So rather than me throwing out a few ideas here at the moment, when actually it's already been written down. Now, once again, a good report has been produced and then not disseminated, not circulated, not the subject of seminars, conferences, roundtable discussions as it should have been. It simply gets produced and then almost put in a shelf or buried in the website. I actually meant before today to examine the website to see if it was any more accessible than it was when I last tried. But why would you put all of these experts together, good people in so many countries, and get them to write a report that actually makes sense and is readable, and then sort of say, well, thank you very much, and we'll put it aside for the moment. If you want people to pay attention to it and to actually face up to it, then you need to disseminate it and discuss it and make it the subject of a widespread consultation as well, and that would then short circuit the kind of time-wasting operation that would be involved in going over individual phrases in a draft strategic concept, which is not particularly productive when we already know what the dangerous threats and problems are, and we've got a very good idea about what to do about them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that that Ambassador Braže already did ask you about the enlargement, and I have one more specific question about the enlargement. As we know, the alliance under the Article 10 of the Washington Treaty remains open to new members, as we concluded in this conversation, if both sides agree about that. Question about the open door policy, but more concerning the part of Europe where I come from, and that's Southeast Europe. And I'm more interested about Western Balkan region. You are very familiar with that region, and geopolitically it is still very sensitive, with many global powers showing their interest there, despite the fact that we have two countries that recently joined NATO, Montenegro and North Macedonia. So my question is it still in NATO's interest to expand? Does it create geopolitically more safe and secure, let's say now, region, because I'm more interested in this region? And how do you look at this NATO's open door policy in the future?
Well, the door is still open, and it has to be open if democracies want to join in a collective security organization, then it should be available to do so, but only if they qualify, only if they come up to the standards that are required. Now, NATO is not the European Union. The European Union has got a process. Your sort of chapters have to be agreed. The acquis has got to be accepted, and then the decision is taken as to whether they become members. In NATO, it's much less formal, but it still has to be demanded. There is no point in a country joining NATO and then making it weaker than it was before. So it has to be made clear that countries who want to join have to sign up to the various components that are involved. That is, as I say, sustainable democratic institutions, good neighborly relations, a military that is compatible with NATO. Each of these things, the rule of law, anti-corruption legislation, the sort of things that we demanded of your country and of the other countries who came in previous enlargements. And we also have to make a decision as to whether or not a country coming in can be defended under Article 5. No point in making sort of gestures. NATO membership is not a gesture. It's solid, absolute commitment on both sides by the NATO countries and by the individual countries as well. So countries, have got to aspire to NATO membership. And I also believe have got to maintain the standards inside when they come inside as well. And I worry that the value systems that we have set out, because NATO is made up of democracies, and that has to do with the rule of law, has to do with the separation of church and state, it has to do with private property, a mixed economy. These are the component parts of democracy, free speech, a free press. All of these things, are part and parcel of the democratic values that NATO stands for and seeks to protect. And therefore, all the time, whether countries outside or inside NATO, we've got to continue to make sure that we represent and stand for these values. And I worry sometimes that individual countries who we brought into NATO, are allowing some of these standards and values to be eroded. And that's wrong. And if we get to the point where the biggest threat to the security and safety of NATO populations is actually inside countries and not outside countries, then that would be a very worrying situation. And our adversaries, our competitors, they watch the gaps, they watch for the cracks in our value system. And that's why they interfere in elections. It's why they encourage corruption. It's why they're involved in organized crime, why they involve themselves in disinformation campaigns, and therefore they're seeking to find the soft underbelly of NATO. There isn't an adversary in the world, whether it's a great country or a collection of countries. Nobody can outgun NATO. With the United States of America, NATO is the biggest military alliance the world has ever known. So we can outgun, we can outfrighten any potential adversary in the world today. And that is why our adversaries look for other ways of subverting NATO's cohesion. And we need to be as aware of that as we are about the kind of weaponry that we have and the kind of money that we spend on defense. The internal enemy could be much more lethal than the external enemy unless we pay attention to protecting the values on which NATO's great strength exists.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And actually, you've just made me scratch one of the questions that was coming up on NATO values and saved me having to pose it rather less delicately than you did. So thank you for that. We don't have time for many more, and I think that I'd just like to take one here that I've seen coming through on the chat facility, which actually represents many who've raised the same topic under different guises. And really, let me just sum it up in NATO's approach, the dual track approach to Russia, coming in from a Lithuanian participant. Have we got the balance about right? What should we be thinking about regarding Russia and the Putin regime? You know, sit it out. Is there something we can do?
Well, let me make some quite brief points about it. First of all, Russia is not Putin, and Putin is not Russia.
Yes. Yeah.
And we need to remember that all the time. The Russian people are not just Vladimir Putin and the clique around him at the present moment. And the Russian people are mostly European people. You know, the year before the pandemic, I was walking in the streets of Moscow, and I thought, you know, I'm in a European city.
Yeah.
These people are no different to the people walking the streets in Rome or in Paris or in London. You know, they are the same as us. And you know, we need to remember that. The second thing we need to remember is that if it had not been for the sacrifice of the Russian people, this conversation today would be taking place in German. We'd be speaking German on this program. So, you know, there is a legacy that is represented by the Russian people themselves, who sacrificed during that period, allowed us to be free today. And I think occasionally we forget that. So we need to keep the engagement going. You know, we have got to remain hostile to what Russia is doing, and especially to this mischief that it is involved in today, whether it's extraterritorial assassinains or the use of chemical weapons, or whether it's cyber attacks and the rest of it, or what's happening in the Donbass and in Crimea. You know, there can't be any weakening of our position on that. At the same time, we need Russia. You know, if we're going to tackle climate change, we need Russia if we're going to tackle the problems of terrorism. You know, a whole series of changes in the world require Russia and the Russian people to be on our side at the present moment. So we've come a long way in the 20 years since I stood with Vladimir Putin talking about the NATO-Russia Council and greater cooperation and looking at, you know, the various strands of work that were being done in the NATO-Russia Council, you know, because the only thing that hasn't changed about Russia is the president. He's still there 20 or 22 years on. Everybody else has changed, but not the president of Russia. But that biologically has to change at some point, and therefore we need to keep our contacts going, keep our connections going, keep our engagement going, because there is no safety in this artificial hostility that President Putin now encourages inside Russia. You know, NATO is not an enemy of Russia. It has no hostile intent towards Russia or the Russian people at all. And therefore, seeing NATO as a threat to Russia is an invention. An invention. It's completely fake, a cosmetic solution to keeping, you know, the Putin clique in power today. And we need to constantly repeat that. NATO is a defensive organization, and it is in any way hostile to anybody. And it will defend its people, its territory, you know, to the very limits of what we have capable there as well. But engagement, whilst remaining firm, has got to be the continuing policy.
Thank you very much. I've just seen my instructions. One more question, and I'd like to reward you. I tried to fill in some of the things that happened on your watch, but could you just tell us personally, as Secretary General of NATO, in a sense, what were the highlights, the lowlights, the difficulties that you faced, if you like, and what you feel your greatest accomplishments? And if you like, what do you wish you'd managed to do that didn't? Take any of those you like.
What do I wish I had done? I think to take on the military committee and the CHODs, the chiefs of defence. I think that would have been one thing, because the average tenure of a minister of defence is about 2 years. The average tenure of a chief of defence is a lifetime, and therefore, I think that they sometimes had a disproportionate influence, and not necessarily in the best possible way. Although that's a generalisation I might regret. Obviously, Article 5 was a very important moment. One of the lowest was dealing with the new which started my time and became a headache that was really a complete pain in the neck. But anyway, I haven't seen it now it's built, but it represented a lot of pain to me. And I tell you what, the best moment was in 2003 in a little village called Tearche in North Macedonia, in the Tetovo Valley in North Macedonia, because we prevented a war in 2001. Sorry, it was in 2001. 2001-2. Anyway, we prevented a war from breaking out in Macedonia at that time. And it would have been a bloody civil war. But the village of Tearche was a mixed village, ethnic Macedonian and Albanian. And it would have been torn apart. Indeed, as the conflict grew before we got a peace agreement, it wasn't. So after the conflict was over, we had the peace agreement, whatever, and I went there one day in a helicopter to that village. Now the kids just thought it was wonderful. TV cameras, helicopters, people coming out. They were all wearing Manchester United strips and Juventus strips and Real Madrid. And they didn't know the difference between NATO and Tesco. All they knew was it was drama. And the thing was that these kids, if we hadn't intervened, NATO, the EU and the OSCE, if we had not intervened and stopped that war, these kids would be refugees today. They could have been dead, injured, mutilated. And here they were in a mixed school, in a mixed village with peace agreement that has solidified that country to this very day, and now North Macedonia is a full member of NATO. But that was one of the most emotional days of my whole time in NATO, because we used all the instruments at our disposal, military, diplomatic, economic, and with the aid of some brave people like President Tchaikovsky at that time, had stopped a war, built a country, built a long-term settlement. And these kids were just so lovely, and they sort of epitomized to me the very best of what we stand for.
Lord Robertson, I can't thank you enough, but I'm not going to thank you at all, because I'm going to hand over to Juxhina Gjoni, who's the president of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, and also Monika Begovic for the wrap-up and the thanks. So instead of thanking you, I will thank our colleagues in public diplomacy who helped us out with all the practical arrangements. And of course, the unseen heroes of the COVID era, all the technical wizards who are making this happen for us via Zoom and the internet. At some point, Lord Robertson, I'd love to get back to you and get you for a second round with the UK ATA, because I've already got loads of questions from ATA to put to you. So let me hand over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Monika.
David.
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, okay.
No.
I just took the floor. Okay, thank you, David, and thank you, Lord Robertson, for dedicating your time and for being here with us today. I would like to start with some personal memories. Let's say I was a young kid only on the aftermath of war in Kosovo, and I started to learn and to rise my interest about NATO, hearing two names, Lord Robertson and Dr. Jamie Shea. And I'm sure that like me and a lot of other young people, not only in the Balkans, we share the same history and have the same impacts on NATO and our opinion as well. And only in 2009, I had the possibility to be part of IATA and the Atlantic Treaty Association. Some years ago, it is my pleasure to share and to be in the same panel with personalities like you, Lord Robertson, and like other personalities that designed all my interests toward NATO. I'm more than honored as well to have in the executive board of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association other young professionals from Georgia, from Italy, Portugal, Serbia as well, part of our association. And we all share one mission, not only to inform one another, but to educate ourselves on the realm of security and defense, on what NATO's mission and core values are. And this is the potential that the Atlantic Treaty Association and their youth branch have to raise awareness and to educate the next generation. I'm glad and honored to be part of this webinar, and would like to thank Monika and David as well, but also NATO Public Diplomacy for their support toward our association. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry.
I didn't know whether my microphone was open, but you know that I very much welcome your kind words as well, and it's really good that you're keeping the flag flying for that younger generation. We were always we were always young once. It's the one thing in life that is absolutely sure that you will eventually get old. So, but we need the younger generation to understand how important it is for them and for their future that collective security is as strong in the future as it has been in the past.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Gina, dear Lord Robertson. Thank you, dear Chair, Ambassador Braže. Thank you, my colleagues from ATA and dear colleagues from NATO Ph.D. Also, dear participants in the audience, I would like to thank you all on behalf of ATA for giving your contribution in one of these very important webinars in the series of webinars that the Atlantic Treaty Association organizes under the name ATA Talks. With today's discussion on the most important alliance in the world, we not only marked NATO's 72 years of existence, but also touched some very important topics for current security architecture that will be most probably tackled during NATO Summit. As Gina, my colleague from IATA, briefly mentioned, ATA is an organization that promotes Euro-Atlantic values together with its member organizations from 37 countries in the world. And our goal is to reach out to you, to public, especially to our youth. With this kind of online activities that we organize, ATA contributes to demonstration of NATO's continuous transformation to meet security challenges. And in accordance to NATO 2030 key priorities, we can say it is an alliance that constantly becomes stronger militarily, politically, and more global. So based on what we heard today, we can say that NATO stands ready, that NATO adapts, NATO shows its resilience, NATO is being stronger politically, and NATO has restored connection with the US and other partners, global partners. So as a military political organization, NATO transforms constantly to meet security challenges, guarantees global peace and security, especially for its member countries. So this was really indeed a very interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed it. once again, I would like to thank you, Lord Robertson, for being our guest speaker, passing your knowledge, experience, reflections, and lessons we can take for the future. And thank you very much for contributing to this webinar. I'm really looking forward to our next event. And in the meantime, on behalf of ATA, I can send our regards to you, to actually all our public that is now with us, all participants, from all of us from ATA around the world. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go and have a cup of tea. Thank you. I declare the meeting closed.
Okay.